Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Steel. Dan Schmidt stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chessboard where he controlled every piece. At 38, he had built Schmidt Enterprises from nothing, a real estate empire worth $500 million that started with a single condemned warehouse he'd bought with his last $1,000 15 years ago. The scar running from his left temple to his jawline told the story of his beginning. His father, Samuel Sherwood, had thrown him out at 18 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a sneer. "You're not my blood," Samuel had spat that night. "Your mother's bastard child will never inherit what's mine." But Dan had taken his mother's maiden name and built something Samuel could never touch, or so he thought. His wife, Jennifer Berg, entered the office without knocking, her blonde hair perfectly styled, designer heels clicking against the marble floor. She'd been a cocktail waitress when they met 10 years ago, but now she carried herself like royalty. Marriage to Dan had given her that confidence, though he'd begun to notice how her eyes never quite met his anymore. "The investors are arriving for tomorrow's IPO celebration," Jennifer said, not looking up from her phone. "I've confirmed the catering and—" "Where were you yesterday afternoon?" Dan's voice was calm, but those who knew him recognized the steel beneath. Jennifer's fingers stilled on her phone screen for just a fraction of a second. "Shopping with Carrie. I told you." Her sister Carrie Valencia had already confirmed Jennifer wasn't with her yesterday, but Dan said nothing. He'd learned long ago that information was more valuable than immediate confrontation. And tonight, dinner with some friends from the charity board. Another lie. Dan's security chief, Bill Hardin, had already confirmed those friends were out of town. Dan turned back to the window. Behind him, Jennifer hesitated, perhaps sensing something different in his demeanor. But she left without another word. 30 minutes later, Marguerite Shepard knocked and entered. His business partner and closest confidant, Marguerite had stood by him through every battle. She was 10 years older, sharp as a blade, and the only person who truly understood Dan's vision. "The final contracts are ready for signature," she said, placing the documents on his desk. "Tomorrow, Schmidt Enterprises goes public, and you'll have liquid assets worth over $800 million. Unless something goes wrong," Dan said quietly. Marguerite studied his face. "What's troubling you?" Dan pulled up the security footage on his computer. Jennifer entering the Ritz-Carlton yesterday at 2 p.m., staying for 3 hours. The same hotel where his brother Ryan Ellison had been staying since arriving in town. "Family," Dan said simply. Marguerite's expression hardened. She'd watched Dan's family circle like vultures for years, waiting for their chance. "What do you need?" "Tomorrow night, after the celebration, I want you to transfer all our international holdings to the Cayman subsidiary. Make it look routine. That's nearly 60% of our assets. Trust me." That evening, Dan returned home to their Beacon Hill mansion to find Jennifer getting ready for her fictional dinner. She wore a red dress he'd bought her in Paris, diamonds glittering at her throat, diamonds he'd earned while his own family had laughed at his ambition. "You look beautiful," he said, meaning it. Despite everything, Jennifer had been the one bright spot in his life for a decade. He'd trusted her with everything. "Thank you." She kissed his cheek, her perfume familiar and intoxicating. "Don't wait up. It might be a late night." As her car pulled away, Dan made a call. "Bill, I need you to follow her." Full surveillance. An hour later, his phone buzzed with photos. Jennifer entering Ryan's hotel room, their embrace in the window, the shadows moving behind closed curtains. Dan stared at the images until they burned into his memory. Then he deleted them and poured himself a scotch. His phone rang. Samuel Sherwood's gruff voice filled the silence. "Boy, tomorrow's your big day. Ryan told me the IPO's guaranteed to double your value overnight." "It is. Good. Maybe you'll finally amount to something worthy of the Sherwood name." Dan almost laughed. Samuel still thought this was about his approval. "Will you be there tomorrow night?" "Wouldn't miss it. Ryan's flying in with some investors from Chicago. Big money boys." After hanging up, Dan walked to his safe and withdrew a thick folder. 5 years of private investigation into Samuel's business dealings, Ryan's gambling debts, and Jennifer's spending habits. He'd hoped never to need it. But hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. Chapter 2. The Web Titans. The morning of the IPO celebration dawned crisp and clear. Schmidt Enterprises stock had opened at $42 and closed at $58 on its first day of trading. The financial press called it one of the most successful public offerings of the year. Dan arrived at the office to find Ryan already there, charming Marguerite's assistant. His younger brother had inherited their father's silver tongue and handsome face, but none of his work ethic. At 35, Ryan lived off trust fund distributions and get-rich-quick schemes that invariably failed. Danny boy, Ryan embraced him with practiced warmth. Incredible day. Mom would be so proud. Their mother had died when Dan was 12, leaving him defenseless against Samuel's cruelty. Ryan had been only 9, too young to remember the nights Dan went hungry, so his little brother could eat. She would be, Dan agreed. How's business in Chicago? Ryan's smile flickered. Growing. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about some opportunities. Real estate development on the South Side. With your success here, we could. I'm not interested in Chicago. Right, of course. You've got enough on your plate. But Dan caught the desperation in Ryan's eyes. The Chicago opportunities were undoubtedly part of some scheme to cover his gambling debts. Tom Patterson, Dan's lawyer and childhood friend, had provided a full financial report. Ryan owed nearly $2 million to some very dangerous people. Jennifer arrived at noon, bringing lunch from Dan's favorite restaurant, a gesture that would have touched him 24 hours ago. Now he saw it for what it was, guilt. You seem tense, she said, watching him push food around his plate. It's a big day. After tonight, we can take that vacation to Greece. Just the two of us. Dan nodded, though they both knew there would be no vacation. By tomorrow, their marriage would be over. That afternoon, Samuel arrived with the Chicago investors. 3 men in expensive suits who looked more like Ryan's creditors than legitimate businessmen. Dan recognized the type from his early days, sharks who smelled blood in the water. My son, Samuel announced proudly to anyone who would listen, built this empire from nothing. The irony wasn't lost on Dan. For 20 years, Samuel had denied their relationship. Now, with cameras rolling and money flowing, Dan was suddenly his son again. The celebration itself was held on the top floor of the Prudential Tower, with panoramic views of Boston's skyline. 300 guests mingled among displays showcasing Schmidt Enterprises' most successful projects. Local politicians, business leaders, and media personalities all came to pay homage to the city's newest tycoon. Dan moved through the crowd like an actor playing a role, accepting congratulations while his mind focused on the evening's true purpose. He'd positioned key allies throughout the room. Tom Patterson near the bar, Bill Hardin monitoring security cameras, Marguerite managing the guest list. At 8 p.m., Samuel called for attention. The crowd gathered as he took the microphone, his weathered face flushed with alcohol and pride. 20 years ago, I told my boy he'd never amount to anything, Samuel began, his voice carrying across the silent room. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Dan Schmidt has shown this city what vision and determination can achieve. Applause rippled through the crowd. Dan smiled and nodded, playing his part perfectly. But success isn't just about one man, Samuel continued. It's about family. And I'm proud to announce that my younger son Ryan has decided to join Schmidt Enterprises as Chief Development Officer. The words hit Dan like a physical blow. He'd suspected something, but this was beyond his worst fears. Around him, the crowd applauded politely, unaware they were witnessing a coup. Ryan stepped forward, grinning. Thank you, Dad. And thank you, Danny, for giving me this opportunity. Dan had never offered his brother any position. This had been planned, orchestrated behind his back. But Samuel wasn't finished. And speaking of family, I have another announcement. He gestured, and Jennifer emerged from the crowd, radiant in her red dress. She walked to Ryan's side, and Dan's blood turned to ice. My son Ryan and Jennifer have some news to share. Ryan took Jennifer's hand, his smile triumphant. Jennifer and I are engaged. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around them, confused murmurs began as guests tried to process what they'd just heard. Samuel's voice boomed over the crowd. All credit goes to my younger son. While Danny built the business, Ryan built the relationships that matter. Love conquers all. Laughter. Some of the guests were actually laughing, thinking this was some elaborate joke. Others looked horrified, finally understanding what was happening. Dan stood frozen, feeling the weight of 300 stares. His wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, and his brother looked at him with expressions mixing guilt and defiance. Danny, Samuel's voice carried a mocking edge. Aren't you going to congratulate the happy couple? The old man was enjoying this. 20 years of resentment crystallized in this moment. Samuel finally had his revenge for Dan's success. Without a word, Dan turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him, the murmurs grew louder, but he didn't look back. He'd given these people everything, his trust, his love, his loyalty, and they'd used it to destroy him publicly. But as he reached the elevator, Dan's reflection in the polished steel doors showed something that would have terrified anyone who truly knew him. He was smiling. Chapter 3. The morning after betrayal. Dan spent the night in his office, not from despair but from calculation. While the city slept, he worked with the cold precision that had built his empire. Every document, every contract, every asset, he reviewed them all with new eyes. At 6 a.m., Marguerite arrived to find him still at his desk, surrounded by legal documents and financial reports. The international transfers are complete, she said without preamble. Cayman Holdings now control 58% of our assets. Good. What about the media response? Contained, mostly. Tom's people killed the story in 3 major outlets, but social media is buzzing. The business press is calling it the most dramatic IPO celebration in history. Dan nodded. His public humiliation would serve his purposes perfectly. There's something else, Marguerite continued. Jennifer called an hour ago. She wants to meet this morning to explain everything. Where? The house. She says Ryan isn't coming. She wants to talk to you alone. Dan almost pitied her. Jennifer still thought she could manipulate him, smooth things over with tears and explanations. She had no idea what she'd awakened. At 9 a.m., Dan arrived at their Beacon Hill mansion to find Jennifer waiting in the living room. She'd been crying. Her makeup was smudged, her perfect facade cracked. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. Dan, please sit down. I need to explain. How long? His voice was quiet, conversational. What? How long have you been sleeping with my brother? Jennifer's composure shattered. 6 months. Maybe 7. I never meant for it to happen, Dan. It just happened. Like falling downstairs. Ryan understands me in ways you don't. You're always working, always focused on the business. I felt invisible. Dan studied her face, memorizing every detail. So you decided to make me invisible instead. It wasn't supposed to be public. Samuel planned that whole announcement without telling us. Ryan was furious. Was he? Dan's smile was arctic. Because he looked quite pleased to me. Jennifer moved closer, her perfume still intoxicating. We can work through this. Marriage counseling, therapy, whatever you need. I made a mistake, but I love you. For a moment, Dan almost believed her. 10 years of marriage couldn't be erased in a single night. But then he remembered the photos, the lies, the public humiliation she'd allowed to happen. I'm filing for divorce today, he said simply. Dan, please. You'll receive the papers by Friday. I suggest you get a lawyer. What about the business? The money. There was the real question. Jennifer had grown accustomed to wealth, to the lifestyle his success provided. The prospect of losing it terrified her more than losing him. You'll get what the prenup allows, which, if you recall, isn't much. Jennifer's face hardened. You can't cut me off completely. I helped build this company. You posed for photographs and attended charity events. That's not building a company. Ryan won't let you destroy me. Dan laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Ryan can't save himself, let alone you. After Jennifer left, Dan called Tom Patterson. His oldest friend arrived within the hour, his expression grim. The divorce papers are ready, Tom said. But Dan, there's something you need to know. Samuel's been making calls all morning. He's trying to organize the board members, convince them you're unstable. Let him. He could force a vote of no confidence. You'd lose control of your own company. Tom, who owns 58% of Schmidt Enterprises International Holdings, the Cayman subsidiary, but Tom's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You moved the assets. Last night, while they were celebrating, Samuel can have the American operations. What's left of them? The real value is offshore now. That's brilliant. But what about Jennifer? She could claim abandonment, argue the prenup is invalid. Dan pulled out a thick folder. Jennifer's been using company credit cards for personal expenses. $300,000 over 2 years. She also has a standing appointment with Dr. Marcus Webb, a fertility specialist. Tom frowned. Fertility specialist. Abortion clinic. She's been taking birth control pills for 10 years while telling me she couldn't conceive. There have been 4 procedures. The betrayal went deeper than adultery. Jennifer had let him believe he was infertile, had watched him blame himself for their childless marriage while secretly ensuring it remained that way. This destroys any sympathy argument, Tom said quietly. And there's more. Dan spread out financial documents. Ryan's gambling debts aren't just the casinos. He owes money to Vincent Torino. Tom paled. Torino was a loan shark with connections to Boston's most dangerous families. How much? $2.7 million. The Chicago investors at last night's party? They work for Torino. Jesus, Dan. If Ryan can't pay, he can't, which is why he needs access to Schmidt Enterprises' assets. So last night wasn't just about stealing your wife. It was about stealing your company to pay his debts. Dan nodded. Samuel thinks he's protecting his golden child. He has no idea he's made Ryan a target. What are you going to do? Dan's smile was predatory. I'm going to give them exactly what they want. That afternoon, Dan called a meeting with Samuel and Ryan. They arrived at his office looking confident, even smug. Samuel wore his best suit, playing the role of concerned father. Ryan had the satisfied expression of a man who thought he'd won. Boys, Samuel began, we need to talk about last night. Emotions were running high. I want Ryan as Chief Development Officer, Dan interrupted. Both men stared at him in shock. Dan, you don't have to, Ryan started. I do. Your family. And after last night, I realize I've been selfish. The company should benefit from your expertise. Samuel's eyes narrowed suspiciously. What's the catch? No catch. But I want Ryan to handle the Chicago development project personally. All of it. The South Side project. Ryan's voice cracked slightly. $2 billion in development potential. It would establish Schmidt Enterprises as a major player in the Midwest market. That's incredible, Dan. Thank you. Dan signed the documents, making Ryan Chief Development Officer with full authority over the Chicago project. As his brother's pen moved across the papers, Dan felt a cold satisfaction. Ryan had no idea he'd just signed his own death warrant. Chapter 4. The Architect of Ruin. 3 days after Ryan's appointment, Dan's plan began to unfold with mechanical precision. From his penthouse office, he watched his brother struggle with responsibilities he'd never been equipped to handle, while Jennifer called repeatedly, calls Dan ignored with satisfying indifference. Carrie Valencia, Jennifer's younger sister, knocked on his office door at precisely 2 p.m. Unlike Jennifer, Carrie had inherited her father's practical intelligence and her mother's moral compass. She'd worked as a forensic accountant before marriage, and her husband's construction company had built half of Schmidt Enterprises' residential projects. You look terrible, she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk. Thank you for coming. Jennifer's been calling me nonstop. She thinks you're planning something. I am. Carrie studied his face, her expression unreadable. She made her choice, Dan. I told her that when she started seeing Ryan. You knew. For months. I begged her to end it, to come clean before it went too far. Carrie's voice carried a mixture of anger and sadness. My sister always chose the easy path. Ryan promised her excitement, adventure, all the things she thought were missing from your marriage. And now she's terrified. The prenup leaves her with almost nothing, and Ryan's already showing his true colors. He barely speaks to her unless he needs something. Dan had expected this. Ryan's pattern was consistent. Charm, conquest, abandonment. Jennifer was learning what Dan had always known about his brother. I have a proposition, Dan said. I'm listening. Jennifer's going to need help when this is over. Financial help, legal protection, maybe a fresh start somewhere. I'm prepared to provide that, Through you. Why? Because despite everything, I don't want to see her destroyed. Humiliated, divorced, financially constrained, yes. But not destroyed. Carrie leaned forward. What do you want in return? Information. Jennifer trusts you. When she talks about Ryan, about Samuel, about their plans, I need to know. You want me to spy on my own sister. I want you to protect your sister from people who are using her. Carrie was quiet for a long moment. Weren't you telling me? Dan slid a photograph across the desk. Ryan entering a warehouse in South Boston, accompanied by two men Carrie would recognize from newspaper crime reports. Vincent Torino's people. Ryan's debts are bigger than anyone realizes, and they're growing daily. How much? Nearly $3 million now, with interest. Carrie's face went white. Jennifer has no idea. Ryan hasn't told her. But when Torino loses patience, and he will, anyone close to Ryan becomes a potential target. You're saying my sister's in danger. I'm saying she's attached herself to a sinking ship, and she doesn't know it's taking on water. That evening, Dan attended a charity gala at the Four Seasons, the same type of event he'd once attended with Jennifer. Now he went alone, playing the role of the wounded but dignified businessman. The sympathy was palpable, and Dan used it expertly. Margaret Chun, the city's most influential real estate developer, approached him during cocktails. Dan, I wanted to express my support during this difficult time. Thank you, Margaret. Business continues. Of course. Actually, I've been meaning to discuss the Harbor Point project with you. Harbor Point was Schmidt Enterprises' largest development, a mixed-use complex that would reshape Boston's waterfront. It was also the project Ryan had been assigned to oversee as his first major responsibility. Ryan's handling that now, Dan said carefully. Yes, I heard, but there are concerns about the timeline. Some of the investors are nervous about the change in leadership. Dan had planted those concerns through careful conversations with key stakeholders. Ryan's eager to prove himself. I'm sure he'll exceed expectations. I hope so. The project's success is crucial for the entire waterfront development plan. That night, Dan reviewed the latest surveillance reports from Bill Hardin. Ryan had been drinking heavily, staying out until dawn, and showing increasing signs of stress. He'd also begun making promises to Jennifer about their future, promises that required access to money he didn't have. The next morning, Marguerite delivered the financial reports Dan had requested. The Cayman subsidiary now controls 72% of our offshore assets, she said. But Dan, there's something unusual in Ryan's expense reports. Show me. The documents revealed a pattern of questionable charges, expensive dinners with unnamed associates, cash advances from company accounts, and consulting fees paid to shell companies. He's skimming, Marguerite said. How much? $200,000 in the past week alone. Dan smiled. Ryan's desperation was making him sloppy, leaving a trail of evidence that would be impossible to explain. Let him continue, Dan said, but document everything. That afternoon, Samuel called demanding a meeting. Dan agreed, curious to see how his father would handle Ryan's growing problems. They met at Samuel's Beacon Hill mansion, the same house where Dan had spent his miserable childhood. The old man looked tired, his usual bluster replaced by worried calculation. Ryan's struggling, Samuel said without preamble. He's learning. It takes time to understand the business. The Harbor Point investors are asking questions. They want to meet with you directly. Then they should schedule an appointment through Ryan. He's in charge of the project. Samuel's facade cracked. Damn it, boy. You know he's not ready for this level of responsibility. Then why did you insist he be promoted? Because... Samuel struggled with words that had never come easily. Because he's my son, and I wanted him to have what you built. The admission hung between them like a blade. For the first time in decades, Samuel was being honest about his motivations. Ryan will succeed or fail based on his own merit, Dan said. Just like I did. You're setting him up to fail. I'm giving him the same chance you gave me. Nothing more, nothing less. After leaving Samuel's house, Dan drove to the South Boston warehouse where Ryan had been meeting with Torino's people. The building was empty now, but Dan had other reasons for being there. Tom Patterson was waiting inside with architectural plans and legal documents. The purchase went through, Tom said. You now own the warehouse and the surrounding block. Excellent. What about the Chicago project? The permits are tied up in bureaucratic delays. Ryan's been calling city officials daily, but it seems like every application gets lost or requires additional documentation. Dan nodded. The delays weren't bureaucratic incompetence. They were carefully orchestrated obstacles designed to prevent Ryan from generating the quick cash he needed to pay his debts. How long before Torino loses patience? Based on his pattern with other debtors? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Perfect timing. As Dan walked through the empty warehouse, he could almost see the pieces of his plan falling into place. Ryan would fail at Harbor Point, Samuel would panic, and Jennifer would realize she'd tied herself to a man with no future. But the beauty of Dan's revenge wasn't just their individual destruction. It was how they would destroy each other trying to save themselves. Chapter 5. The Pressure Builds. 2 weeks later, cracks began appearing in the facade Ryan had built around himself. Dan watched from his office as his brother paced the conference room during a heated phone call with Harbor Point investors, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Carrie Valencia's intelligence reports had proven invaluable. Jennifer was growing increasingly anxious about Ryan's behavior. His drinking, his secretive phone calls, his promises about their future that seemed to change daily. She confided to Carrie that Ryan had asked her to liquidate her jewelry collection for temporary cash flow issues. She started to ask questions, Carrie reported during their weekly meeting, about Ryan's finances, about why you're being so cooperative with his promotion. What does she suspect? That you're planning something. Jennifer's not stupid, Dan. She knows you well enough to recognize when you're playing a role. And Ryan, he's desperate. Last night he asked Jennifer about your personal accounts. Wanted to know if she had access to any of your offshore holdings. Dan filed that information away. Ryan's timeline was accelerating, which meant Torino was applying pressure. The next morning brought the first crisis Dan had been orchestrating. Margaret Shin called an emergency meeting with all Harbor Point stakeholders, expressing concerns about project delays and cost overruns. Dan arrived at the meeting to find Ryan already there, looking like he hadn't slept in days. The assembled investors, pension fund managers, private equity partners, and municipal officials filled the conference room with barely contained anxiety. The project is 3 weeks behind schedule, Margaret began without preamble. The environmental impact studies are incomplete, the construction permits are still pending, and preliminary cost estimates have increased by 15%. These are normal development challenges, Ryan said, his voice strained. Every major project faces. Normal challenges don't require emergency meetings, interrupted James Morrison, the pension fund's lead representative. We've invested $60 million based on Schmidt Enterprises' reputation for on-time, on-budget delivery. All eyes turned to Dan. He'd built that reputation over 15 years of flawless execution, and everyone in the room knew it. My brother is handling this project independently, Dan said calmly. I have complete confidence in his abilities. The words were supportive, but his tone carried subtle implications that everyone understood. Dan was distancing himself from Ryan's failures while maintaining plausible deniability. Perhaps we need a consulting arrangement, suggested Morrison. Ryan leading the project with Dan providing oversight. That won't be necessary, Ryan said quickly. Too quickly. Dan studied his brother's face and saw the panic beneath the bravado. Ryan couldn't afford oversight. It would expose the money he'd been stealing from project accounts. Actually, Dan said thoughtfully, an independent audit might reassure everyone. Bring in outside accountants to review all project expenses to date. The color drained from Ryan's face. An audit isn't. We don't need. Excellent idea, Morrison said. Complete transparency builds confidence. After the meeting, Ryan cornered Dan in the hallway, his composure finally cracking. What the hell are you doing? Managing investor relations. You seemed overwhelmed. I'm not overwhelmed. I'm handling everything perfectly. Are you? Dan's voice was mild, curious. Because from where I sit, it looks like you're drowning. You sabotaged the permits. I know you did. Dan smiled. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? Ryan's hands were shaking now, whether from anger, fear, or withdrawal from whatever he'd been using to cope. I know you, Danny. You never forgive anyone who crosses you. No, Dan agreed. I don't. That afternoon, Dan received an unexpected visitor. Vincent Torino himself appeared in his office lobby, accompanied by two men who looked like they crushed concrete for exercise. Torino was smaller than Dan had expected, maybe 5'8" with graying hair and the soft appearance of a man who'd spent more time counting money than breaking bones. But his eyes were arctic, and his presence filled the room like a gathering storm. Mr. Schmidt, Torino said, settling into a chair without invitation. We should talk. About? Your brother owes me money. A lot of money. Ryan's financial decisions are his own responsibility. Usually, yes. But when family's involved, things get complicated. Torino's smile was reptilian. You're a businessman. You understand leverage. I understand that my brother's debts aren't my concern. They're when he's chief development officer of your company, when he's using your resources to try to pay me back. So Torino knew about the skimming. Dan filed that information away while maintaining his neutral expression. If you have evidence of corporate malfeasance, I suggest you contact the authorities. Torino laughed, a sound like grinding glass. The authorities, right? No, Mr. Schmidt. This is a private matter between businessmen. Then conduct your business privately. With Ryan. See, that's the problem. Ryan's made promises he can't keep. The Chicago project he's been telling me about, seems like that's not working out so well. Dan said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. But you, Torino continued, you've got resources. Real resources. Maybe we could work something out. I'm not interested in partnerships with loan sharks. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Torino's associates shifted slightly, their jackets opening just enough to reveal shoulder holsters. Loan shark is such an ugly term, Torino said softly. I prefer alternative financing specialist. Call yourself whatever you like. The answer is no. Torino stood slowly, his movements deliberate. Your brother has 2 weeks to settle his account. After that, well, accidents happen, especially to people who think they're untouchable. After they left, Dan called Bill Harden. Triple security around the building and my house, he ordered. And put a detail on Carrie Valencia. She might become a target if Torino decides to apply leverage through Jennifer. What about Jennifer herself? Dan considered that. Despite everything, he didn't want Jennifer hurt. Humiliated and divorced, yes, but not physically harmed. Discreet protection. Don't let her know. That evening, Dan worked late reviewing the final details of his plan. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the end for Ryan, Samuel, and Jennifer. But as he prepared to leave, his private elevator chimed, and Jennifer emerged. She looked terrible, dark circles under her eyes, her usual perfect appearance disheveled. She'd been crying, and her hands shook as she approached his desk. Dan, I need your help. You need a lawyer. Please. Ryan's in trouble. Real trouble. What kind of trouble? He owes money to dangerous people. They came to the house tonight. Dan's blood chilled. What did they say? That Ryan had 2 weeks to pay $3 million, or they'd start collecting from his family members. Jennifer's voice broke. They knew about me, about Carrie, about you. They knew everything. What did you tell them? Nothing. I was terrified. Ryan tried to act tough, but they laughed at him. Called him a trust fund baby playing in the adult world. Dan moved around the desk and guided Jennifer to a chair. Whatever she'd done to him, she didn't deserve to be terrorized by Torino's animals. Where's Ryan now? I don't know. He left after they did. Said he was going to fix everything. Jennifer, listen to me carefully. You're going to go to Carrie's house tonight. Don't go home. Don't call Ryan. Don't tell anyone where you are. Dan, what's happening? What kind of business is Ryan involved in? For a moment, Dan considered telling her everything about Ryan's gambling, the stolen money, the Chicago project that was never real. But Jennifer would have to learn those truths herself. The kind that gets people killed, he said simply. As Dan drove home that night, he felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. His plan was working perfectly, but Torino's direct threat had escalated the timeline. Ryan was running out of options, which made him exponentially more dangerous. But danger had never deterred Dan Schmidt. If anything, it sharpened his focus. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. The next morning brought news that crystallized Dan's victory. Harbor Point's independent audit had uncovered $800,000 in missing funds, all traced to Ryan's executive accounts. The pension fund representatives were demanding criminal charges, and the project insurance company was threatening to cancel coverage. Dan sat in his office reviewing the audit reports when Samuel burst in without announcement, his face purple with rage. "You orchestrated this," Samuel snarled, slamming the documents on Dan's desk. "Every permit delay, every bureaucratic obstacle. You planned all of it. I gave Ryan exactly what he asked for, authority over a major project. You set him up to fail. I set him up to succeed. His failures are his own." Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's your brother. He's your son. I'm just a bastard you threw out at 18, remember? That was a long time ago. It was yesterday. It was this morning. It's every time you look at me and see something that doesn't belong to you." Samuel seemed to age 10 years in that moment, his bluster collapsing into exhausted defeat. "What do you want? Money? Control of my holdings? Name your price. I want nothing from you. I never did. Then why? Why destroy him?" Dan stood and walked to the window overlooking the city he'd conquered. "Because he destroyed me first. At my IPO celebration, in front of 300 people, he took my wife and you applauded him for it. Jennifer chose to leave. Jennifer was seduced by promises Ryan can't keep. Now she's learning what those promises are worth." Samuel's phone rang, a harsh sound in the tension-filled room. After a brief conversation, he hung up with trembling hands. "The police want to interview Ryan about the missing Harbor Point funds. Then he should cooperate fully." "Damn it, Dan. Help him." "Help him what? Flee the country? Hide stolen money? Lie to investigators?" Dan turned back to his father. "You wanted Ryan to have what I built. Well, this is what I built. A business where actions have consequences." After Samuel left, Marguerite arrived with additional intelligence. "Ryan's been calling international banks," she reported. "He's trying to transfer money offshore, but most of his accounts are frozen pending the audit. In Torino, our sources say he's growing impatient. 2 of his associates were seen near Ryan's apartment building this morning." "What about Jennifer?" "Still at Carrie's house. She's been calling Ryan constantly, but he's not answering." Dan nodded. The pressure was building exactly as he'd planned. Ryan was trapped between criminal charges and loan shark threats, with no way out except through Dan, who would offer no mercy. That afternoon, Ryan finally appeared at Schmidt Enterprises, escorted by Tom Patterson and a criminal defense lawyer Dan didn't recognize. Ryan looked like he'd aged a decade in 24 hours, unshaven, hollow-eyed, wearing the same clothes from yesterday. "We need to talk," Ryan said without preamble. "Your lawyer's present. This conversation is being recorded. Dan, please. Family to family. We could discuss business matters through appropriate channels." Ryan's lawyer, a nervous man named David Geller, cleared his throat. "Mr. Schmidt, my client is prepared to make full restitution for any missing project funds." "Restitution? With what money?" Dan asked. "According to the audit, Ryan's personal accounts contain approximately $12,000. We're exploring various options, like Vincent Torino's money." The room went silent. Ryan's face turned ashen, while his lawyer looked confused. "Mr. Schmidt," Geller said carefully, "I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm implying that your client owes money to a dangerous man, and he's been using company funds to try to pay that debt." "That's not. I never." Ryan struggled for words. $3 million, Dan continued relentlessly, "to a loan shark who specializes in breaking legs when payments are late." "How do you know about Torino?" Ryan whispered. "I know everything, Ryan. The gambling, the debts, the stolen money, the threats. I know about the warehouse meetings, the fake Chicago investors, the promises you made to Jennifer about a future you can't deliver." Ryan's lawyer was scribbling notes frantically, clearly realizing his client had been less than honest about the scope of his problems. "What do you want?" Ryan asked. "I want you to resign from Schmidt Enterprises immediately. I want you to cooperate fully with the police investigation. And I want you to disappear from Boston." "I can't just disappear." Torino will find me anywhere. That's not my problem. Dan, please. You're my brother. Blood is blood. Dan smiled. The same cold expression that had terrified business rivals for 15 years. Blood is blood. That's why you're still breathing. After they left, Dan made a series of phone calls. The first was to a private airfield outside Boston, arranging transportation for someone who might need to leave the country quickly. The second was to an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands, confirming transfer protocols for a large cash transaction. The third call was to Vincent Torino. Mr. Torino, this is Dan Schmidt. I believe we have some business to discuss. An hour later, Torino arrived with the same two associates, but this time his demeanor was more respectful. Dan had resources Torino wanted, and they both knew it. Mr. Schmidt, I was hoping you'd reconsider our conversation. I have a proposition, Dan said. Ryan's debt, plus accumulated interest. What's the total? $3.2 million as of today. I'll transfer that amount to an account of your choosing. Torino's eyes narrowed suspiciously. In exchange for, Ryan's debt is forgiven, and you never contact any member of my family again. And your brother? Ceases to be your concern. Why would you do this? After everything he's done to you? Dan considered the question. The honest answer was complex, part pragmatism, part residual family loyalty, part cold calculation about removing variables from his revenge. Because I want him to live with his failures, not die because of them. $3.2 million is a lot of money to save a man who stole your wife. It's a small price to remove a distraction. Torino studied Dan's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Transfer the money by tomorrow midnight. After that, Ryan Schmidt doesn't exist as far as my organization is concerned. Agreed. After Torino left, Dan sat alone in his office, watching the sun set over Boston. By tomorrow night, Ryan would be free from immediate physical danger, but facing criminal charges and public disgrace. Jennifer would learn that her lover was a thief and a coward. Samuel would watch his golden child fall from grace. And Dan would finally have the peace that came with perfect revenge. His phone buzzed with a text from Carrie. Jennifer wants to see you. She knows about the missing money. Dan typed back, tomorrow, after the debt is settled. There would be time for explanations later. Tonight, he had one final transfer to make, one last piece of his plan to execute. By midnight, Vincent Torino would be $3 million richer, and Dan Schmidt would own his brother's life completely. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Begins. The transfer went through at 11:47 p.m., sending $3.2 million to an account in Torino's name. Dan watched the confirmation appear on his screen with the same detachment he'd once felt while reviewing quarterly earnings reports. It was simply another business transaction, albeit one that purchased his brother's life. The next morning brought chaos. Ryan's arrest for embezzlement made the front page of the Boston Globe, complete with photos of him being led away in handcuffs. The headline read, Real estate heir charged in multi-million-dollar theft. Jennifer arrived at Dan's office before 9 a.m., her face a mask of shock and betrayal. She moved like someone in a trance, as if the world had shifted beneath her feet and she couldn't find solid ground. Is it true? She asked without preamble. Which part? All of it. The stolen money, the gambling debts, the loan sharks. Yes. Jennifer sank into the chair across from his desk, her perfect composure finally cracking completely. He told me he was building something. That Chicago project was going to make him rich, make us rich. There never was a Chicago project. Just desperate lies to justify stealing from Harbor Point accounts. But the investors, Torino's people, Ryan owed them money, so he created a fantasy about development opportunities to keep them interested. Jennifer's hands shook as she processed this information. How long have you known? About the affair? Months. About the gambling and theft? Weeks. You could have warned me. Would you have listened? The question hung between them like an accusation. They both knew the answer. Jennifer had been too intoxicated by Ryan's promises of excitement and adventure to hear warnings about his character. What happens now? She whispered. Now you face the consequences of your choices. Dan, please. I know I hurt you, but we had 10 years together. That has to count for something. It does count. It's why you're not facing criminal charges as an accessory. Jennifer's eyes widened. What do you mean? Ryan used company credit cards in your name. Expensive dinners, hotel rooms, jewelry purchases, all while he was embezzling project funds. Technically, you could be charged as a co-conspirator. But I didn't know. I know, which is why I made sure the prosecutors understood your situation. Jennifer stared at him, finally beginning to understand the scope of Dan's planning. You orchestrated all of this. I gave Ryan enough rope to hang himself. He chose to tie the noose. And me? Was I just collateral damage? Dan studied her face, still beautiful despite the tears, still the woman he'd loved for a decade. You made your choice, Jennifer. You chose Ryan over me, excitement over security, passion over partnership. Now you get to live with that choice. I was wrong. I know that now. Ryan is weak, selfish, everything you said he was. And what am I? Ruthless, cold, unforgiving. Jennifer's voice was barely a whisper. But you're also strong, loyal, and honest. I threw away the best thing in my life for a fantasy. Yes, you did. Can't we? Isn't there some way to fix this? Dan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Fix what? The divorce papers were finalized yesterday. You're no longer my wife. Legally, no. But emotionally, you died the night you chose my brother over me. The words hit Jennifer like physical blows. She began crying again, but these weren't the calculated tears of manipulation. They were raw, desperate sobs of genuine grief. I loved you, she said through the tears. No, you loved the life I provided. The house, the money, the status. When Ryan offered something more exciting, you traded up. That's not true, isn't it? When did you last ask about my dreams, my fears, my struggles? When did you last want to know about me as a person rather than a provider? Jennifer opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. They both knew the answer. I'm not a monster, Jennifer. You'll receive the alimony specified in our prenup, enough to maintain a comfortable lifestyle. Carrie has offered you a position with her husband's construction company. You can rebuild your life. Without you. Without me. Jennifer stood slowly, as if movement caused her physical pain. What about Ryan? What about him? Will he go to prison? Probably. Tom estimates 18 months to 3 years, depending on plea negotiations. And the loan shark? No longer a factor. Jennifer's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You paid his debt. I eliminated a variable. $3 million to save a man who betrayed you. $3 million to control the narrative. Ryan's alive to face justice rather than dead from a loan shark's bullet. It's a better ending. For whom? For everyone who has to live with the consequences. After Jennifer left, Dan turned his attention to the final phase of his plan. Samuel had been calling all morning, demanding meetings, threatening lawsuits, desperately trying to save his son. But Dan had one more lesson to teach the old man. At 2 p.m., Samuel arrived with his lawyer and a team of accountants, clearly prepared for battle. I want control of my son's legal defense, Samuel announced. Whatever it costs. That's between you and Ryan's attorneys. I also want a full accounting of your role in this disaster. What role would that be? Don't play innocent with me, boy. You destroyed him systematically. Dan spread out documents across the conference table, bank records, audit reports, police statements. I gave Ryan authority over $1 billion project. These documents show how he used that authority. Samuel's lawyer, Philip Crane, reviewed the papers with growing concern. Mr. Sherwood, these are copies of bank transfers, gambling receipts, and loan documentation. Your son appears to have stolen nearly $1 million. That's impossible. The paper trail is comprehensive, Crane continued. Casino receipts, wire transfers to offshore accounts, payments to known loan sharks. This is federal-level embezzlement. Samuel's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and finally, horrified understanding. You knew, he said to Dan. You knew he was gambling, knew he was in debt, and you gave him access to more money anyway. I gave him the opportunity to succeed. He chose to steal instead. You could have helped him. The way you helped me? By throwing me out at 18? By denying I was your son for 20 years? By celebrating when I was publicly humiliated? That was different. No, it wasn't. You taught me that family means nothing when personal interest is at stake. I learned that lesson well. Samuel seemed to collapse inward, his age finally showing. What do you want from me? Nothing. I never wanted anything from you. Then why? Why destroy Ryan? Why destroy Jennifer? Why destroy everything? Dan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city he'd conquered. Because you taught me that strength is the only thing that matters. You showed me that mercy is weakness, that forgiveness is failure. I became exactly what you wanted me to become. I never wanted this. You wanted a son who wouldn't need your approval, who wouldn't flinch when threatened, who would crush anyone who opposed him. Congratulations, you got exactly what you asked for. Samuel left without another word, his lawyer trailing behind with confused apologies. Dan watched them go, feeling something he couldn't quite identify. Not satisfaction, not victory, but perhaps something like closure. His phone buzzed with a text from Marguerite. Ryan's pleading guilty to reduced charges. 18 months, minimum security. Dan typed back, good. He'll survive that. Another text, this time from Carrie. Jennifer's moving back to California. She wanted me to say goodbye for her. Dan didn't respond to that one. There was nothing left to say. As the sun set over Boston, Dan Schmidt sat alone in his office, master of an empire built on the ruins of his family's betrayal. He'd won completely, utterly, without mercy or compromise. But as he watched the city lights begin to twinkle below, he couldn't shake the feeling that victory tasted different than he'd expected. Chapter 8. The Final Blow. 6 months later, Dan stood in the marble lobby of his newest acquisition, the Sherwood Building, a 40-story monument to old Boston money that had housed Samuel's corporate headquarters for 3 decades. The irony of owning his father's legacy wasn't lost on him. Samuel had been forced to sell when Ryan's legal fees and restitution payments drained the family's liquid assets. Dan had made the winning bid through a shell company, paying exactly what the building was worth. No vindictive lowball offers, no petty manipulation. He'd simply outbid everyone else with clinical precision. The takeover had been swift and comprehensive. Samuel's real estate empire, built over 40 years, had crumbled in 6 months. Without Ryan to groom as his successor, and with mounting legal costs bleeding cash, the old man had been forced to liquidate assets to survive. Dan rode the elevator to the top floor, Samuel's former executive suite, now his own. The view was spectacular, overlooking Boston Harbor and the financial district he'd helped reshape. But the victory felt hollow, somehow, like consuming a meal without tasting it. Marguerite found him there an hour later, reviewing the acquisition documents with the same methodical attention he applied to every business decision. The transition is complete, she reported. All former Sherwood Holdings properties are now under Schmidt Enterprises management. What about the employees? Retained, as you specified. Samuel's people know the properties better than anyone. Good. Continuity matters. Marguerite studied his face with the concern of someone who'd known him for 15 years. Dan, are you sure about this? About what? All of it. The acquisitions, the expansion, this. She gestured around the opulent office. This isn't you. It's exactly me. It's what I built. No, what you built was innovative, creative, forward-thinking. This is just conquest for the sake of conquest. Dan turned back to the window, watching ships navigate the harbor far below. Samuel always said I'd never amount to anything worthy of the Sherwood name. Now I own the Sherwood name. And what's left? You've destroyed your family, divorced your wife, bankrupted your father. What happens next? It was a question Dan had been avoiding for months. The mechanics of revenge had consumed him completely, but now that victory was achieved, he felt strangely empty. I built something new, he said finally. With whom? You've isolated yourself from everyone who cared about you. People care about success. I'm successful. People cared about Dan Schmidt, the man who built an empire from nothing. They respected his vision, his integrity, his loyalty to those who supported him. Marguerite's voice was gentle but firm. This version of you, the one who destroys families and buys vengeance, isn't someone to admire. Before Dan could respond, his assistant announced a visitor, Detective Maria Santos from the Boston Police Department. She entered the office with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with powerful people who thought themselves above consequences. "Mr. Schmidt, I wanted to update you on the Ryan Ellison case." "I'm listening." "He's been released to a minimum security facility in Connecticut. Model prisoner, enrolled in addiction counseling, expected to serve 16 months total." "And the restitution?" "Being paid through an asset forfeiture program. Your brother's personal property, investment accounts, even his car. Everything liquidated to repay Harbor Point investors." Dan nodded. Ryan would emerge from prison with nothing. No money, no reputation, no prospects. It was a different kind of death sentence. "There's something else," Detective Santos continued. "We received an interesting call yesterday. Anonymous tip about Vincent Torino's organization." "What kind of tip?" "Someone provided detailed financial records showing money laundering through real estate transactions. Torino was arrested this morning on federal charges." Dan kept his expression neutral, but inwardly he smiled. Paying Torino's organization to leave Ryan alone hadn't meant forgetting their existence. A few carefully placed calls to federal authorities had ensured that particular threat was permanently neutralized. "Interesting," he said mildly. "Very interesting." The caller knew things only someone with inside access could know. Transaction dates, account numbers, property transfers going back 5 years. "I hope you catch whoever's responsible for such crimes." Detective Santos studied his face for a moment, then smiled slightly. "I'm sure justice will be served. Have a good day, Mr. Schmidt." After she left, Marguerite shook her head in amazement. "Torino too? How many enemies did you eliminate in one campaign?" "All of them." "And now?" Dan walked to his desk and picked up a thick folder he'd been reviewing. Architectural plans for a massive development project in South Boston, the same area where he'd grown up poor and powerless. "Now, I build something that matters." The plans showed a mixed-use development unlike anything Boston had seen. Affordable housing integrated with commercial space, community centers, educational facilities. It was the kind of project that would transform neighborhoods rather than simply generate profit. "This is what you've been working on?" "For months. While everyone thought I was focused on revenge, I was designing something constructive." "It's beautiful, Dan. But why South Boston? Why that neighborhood?" "Because it's where I learned that poverty isn't about money, it's about powerlessness. This development gives people power over their own lives." Marguerite smiled for the first time in months. "This is who you really are." "No, this is who I'm choosing to become." That evening, Dan drove through South Boston, past the warehouse he'd bought months earlier, past the tenements where he'd spent his childhood, past the vacant lots that would soon house his vision of the future. His phone rang. Carrie Valencia calling with news about Jennifer. "She's doing well in California," Carrie reported. "Started her own interior design business, small but growing. She asks about you sometimes." "What do you tell her?" "That you're the same as always, focused, driven, impossible to read." "Maybe that's changing." "Good. She loved you, you know. Really loved you. Not just the lifestyle. But not enough to stay faithful. No, not enough for that. But enough to regret it every day." Dan considered this information without the burning anger that would have consumed him 6 months ago. Jennifer's betrayal had wounded him deeply, but the wound was healing, scarred over but no longer bleeding. "Tell her I hope she's happy," he said finally. "You mean that?" "I'm learning to mean it." After hanging up, Dan parked outside the old warehouse and walked through the empty space, envisioning the community center it would become. For the first time in months, he felt something approaching peace. His revenge was complete, his enemies defeated, his empire expanded beyond anything Samuel had ever achieved. But more importantly, he was finally building something that would outlast his anger. Chapter 9. Empire of Redemption. 2 years later, Dan stood before the Boston City Council presenting his South Boston Renewal Project to a packed chamber. The plans had evolved from simple development into something unprecedented, a comprehensive neighborhood transformation that would house 10,000 people while creating 15,000 jobs. The opposition was predictable. Established developers who resented the competition, politicians who questioned the economics, community activists who suspected gentrification. But Dan had learned something crucial during his campaign of revenge. That real power came not from destroying enemies, but from building something they couldn't tear down. The critics are right about one thing, Dan said, addressing the council directly. This project will change South Boston forever. Children who grow up in these neighborhoods will have opportunities their parents never imagined. Families will own homes instead of renting tenements. Local businesses will thrive instead of surviving. Councilwoman Patricia Moore, a longtime skeptic of development projects, leaned forward. Mr. Schmidt, your company's profit margins on this project are remarkably low. Some analysts suggest you'll barely break even. Why? Because profit isn't the only measure of success. That's an unusual philosophy for I'm not a usual real estate developer. The vote was unanimous approval, but Dan barely noticed the applause. His attention was focused on two figures in the gallery, Samuel and Ryan, sitting together in the back row. After the meeting, Dan waited in the corridor as father and son approached. Samuel looked every one of his 72 years, his once imposing frame bent with age and defeat. Ryan appeared healthier than Dan had seen him in years, clean, sober, wearing the simple clothes of a man who'd learned to live without excess. "Hello, Danny," Samuel said quietly. "Samuel, Ryan." The three men stood in awkward silence, surrounded by the echoes of footsteps and distant conversations. Finally, Ryan spoke. "I wanted to apologize. For everything. You already did that. Multiple times. I know, but..." Ryan struggled for words. "Prison gives you time to think about the choices you've made, the people you've hurt. And what did you conclude? That I spent my whole life trying to be something I wasn't, instead of figuring out who I actually was." Dan studied his brother's face, searching for traces of the charming manipulator who'd stolen his wife and embezzled his money. What he saw instead was someone who looked genuinely broken and rebuilt. Harder edges worn smooth, artificial confidence replaced by quiet humility. "What are you doing now?" "Community service supervisor for ex-offenders transitioning back to society. The pay's terrible, but it's honest work." "And Jennifer?" Ryan's expression tightened slightly. "Jennifer and I haven't spoken since my arrest. What we had was built on lies, and it collapsed when the truth came out." Samuel cleared his throat. "Danny, I know I have no right to ask anything of you." "You're right. You don't. But I'm asking anyway. For forgiveness. Not for me, but for the family we could still be." Dan looked at his father, really looked at him for the first time in years. The man who'd terrorized his childhood was gone, replaced by a broken old man seeking absolution he didn't deserve. "I don't forgive you," Dan said calmly. "I don't forgive Ryan. I don't forgive Jennifer. Forgiveness is for the past, and the past is dead." Samuel's face fell, but Dan continued. "But I don't need to carry that anger anymore either. You taught me that strength matters, that loyalty must be earned, that respect comes from actions rather than words. Those lessons shaped everything I built. And now I'm building something bigger than revenge." Dan gestured toward the chamber where the South Boston project had just been approved. "This will house 30,000 people over the next decade. It will create jobs, rebuild communities, give kids growing up like I did a chance at something better." "That's incredible, Dan," Ryan said. "It's exactly what this city needs. It's what every city needs. I'm expanding the model to Detroit, Cleveland, Newark, anywhere poverty and powerlessness intersect." Samuel stared at his son with something approaching awe. "This is your life's work. This is my redemption." The old man seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. Would it be possible for us to have dinner sometime? As a family?" "We're not a family, Samuel. We're three men who happen to share some DNA and a complicated history. But maybe we could be something better than enemies." Dan considered the request. 2 years ago, he would have rejected it immediately, taken satisfaction in watching his father grovel for attention. But the man standing before him posed no threat, offered no challenge worth conquering. "Maybe," he said finally, "but not as the family we were, as the people we're choosing to become." After they left, Dan drove to the harbor, where the first phase of his South Boston project was already under construction. Cranes pierced the sky like mechanical prayers. Workers moved with purposeful energy, and slowly, methodically, something beautiful was taking shape. His phone buzzed with a text from Marguerite. CNN wants an interview about the renewal project. Something about billionaire developer with a conscience. Dan typed back, schedule it. But make sure they understand this isn't charity. It's evolution. As the sun set over Boston Harbor, Dan Schmidt stood alone, but not lonely, watching his city transform. The empire he'd built on revenge was becoming something else entirely. A legacy of construction rather than destruction, creation rather than conquest. He thought about Jennifer, rebuilding her life in California. About Ryan, earning redemption through service to others. About Samuel, learning to live with the consequences of his choices. They were all finding their own paths forward just as he was finding his. The scars remained, they always would. But scars were proof of survival, evidence that wounds could heal even when forgiveness seemed impossible. Dan Schmidt had gotten his revenge completely, ruthlessly, without mercy or compromise. He destroyed his enemies and proven his strength beyond any doubt. But more importantly, he learned that the greatest victory wasn't defeating those who'd wronged him. It was becoming someone worthy of the power he'd won. The empire would continue growing, but now it would build rather than merely dominate. And in the end, that would be a legacy worth more than all the revenge in the world. Epilogue. 5 years later, the Schmidt Foundation had built housing and community centers in 12 cities, providing homes for over 50,000 people and creating more than 100,000 jobs. Dan remained CEO of Schmidt Enterprises, but spent most of his time traveling between projects, working with architects and community leaders to design developments that serve people rather than simply generating profit. He never remarried, though he dated occasionally, women who challenged him intellectually and shared his vision for urban renewal. The loneliness that had once driven him to work 18-hour days had been replaced by a sense of purpose that filled the spaces where family once lived. Jennifer had built a successful design firm specializing in affordable housing interiors. They exchanged Christmas cards, but never spoke directly. Some wounds healed into scars. Others simply faded into memory. Ryan continued his work with ex-offenders and had never touched alcohol or entered a casino since his release. He'd written Dan several letters over the years, not asking for money or forgiveness, but sharing updates about his work and expressing genuine pride in his brother's accomplishments. Dan read them all, but never responded. Some distances were meant to be maintained. Samuel died peacefully in his sleep at age 75, leaving behind a simple will that donated his remaining assets to charity. Dan attended the funeral but didn't speak, standing in the back while Ryan delivered a eulogy about redemption and second chances. The real estate empire that had started with a single condemned warehouse now spanned continents, but its purpose had evolved beyond profit. Dan Schmidt had learned that true power wasn't about destroying enemies. It was about building something so substantial, so meaningful, that it outlasted both the builder and his battles. In the end, revenge had been sweet, but redemption was sweeter still. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.